In October of 1849, a coastal brig called the Aveline left Savannah carrying 173 enslaved people and enough paperwork to make the voyage look ordinary. The run to Charleston should have taken less than 2 days. The ship never arrived. No wreckage, no survivors, no public mourning. Only an insurance claim, and 14 months later, a hurricane that tore the roof off a warehouse beside a forgotten Georgia salt creek and exposed a row of brick chambers buried underneath the floor. This is not a ghost story. It is worse. It is a story about what men with money did when they realized they could steal human beings twice. First as cargo, then again as profit. The official records of coastal Georgia described the Aveline as a routine commercial vessel. 2 masts, shallow enough draft for the inlets, reliable in fair weather, useful for moving rice, cotton, and when the market demanded it, enslaved people between ports. In the autumn of 1849, the vessel was chartered by a Savannah firm called Hollis and Pike. The manifest listed bales of cotton, preserved food, hardware crates, and 173 enslaved men, women, and children, consigned for sale farther up the coast. The language in the paperwork was clinical, efficient, completely stripped of human truth. The captain was Nathaniel Voss, 43 years old, a practiced coastal navigator with a reputation for discipline and a family connection to the company that had chartered him. On paper, he was a safe pair of hands, which is exactly what made the disappearance so easy to misread. Because when a reckless man vanishes with a ship, people suspect crime. When a respectable man vanishes with proper signatures, sealed manifests, and the blessing of a trading house, people call it bad luck. At first, almost nobody panicked. Delays happened. Weather changed. Sandbars shifted. Messages moved slowly. And the people below deck were not treated by the law as lives whose absence demanded urgent action. They were entries in a ledger. If the ship was lost, the loss was calculated in dollars, not in grief. 2 weeks passed before Hollis and Pike filed a formal notice in Savannah. The language of that notice survives in a copied abstract from county papers. It did not ask where 173 people had gone. It asked what had become of property of uncommon value. That sentence tells you nearly everything about the world this story comes from. Search boats moved along the coast. Pilots were questioned. Harbor watchmen were asked whether they had seen broken planks, drifting casks, human remains, anything at all. They found nothing. No splinter field on the water, no washed-up bodies, no witness who could say the brig had foundered in a gale. It was as if the Aveline had sailed out of the river mouth and been erased. And that might have been the end of it. Another lost ship, another swallowed file, another historical silence. Except that in a settlement called Brackish Point, a low, muddy cluster of storehouses and fishermen's cottages near the marshes south of Sapelo Sound, a stranger appeared 4 days after the Aveline departed Savannah. He gave his name as Elias Vale. He said he was a rice broker from Wilmington, looking to lease storage near the tidal creeks. Nobody in Brackish Point knew him. Nobody could place his accent with certainty, but they remembered his money. He paid for an abandoned indigo warehouse in gold coin. Not banknotes, not a promissory letter, gold. And before he made a single improvement above ground, he hired laborers to dig below it. That is where the trail begins to darken. The old warehouse sat on slightly raised land between reeds and blackwater channels, the kind of place wagon wheels sank half a foot after rain, and strangers were noticed mostly by the noises they made. Men from the settlement later told investigators that Elias Vale ordered brick by the cartload, lime by the barrel, timber beams thicker than seemed necessary, and iron fittings of a kind more common in jails and shipholds than in an ordinary storehouse. When asked what he was building, he smiled and called it secure storage for sensitive goods. Some laughed and assumed he was hiding contraband tobacco. Others said he looked like a man building a place that was meant to keep sound from getting out. The autumn turned toward winter, and Brackish Point began hearing things. Wagons after midnight, hooves stopping behind shuttered walls, men speaking in low voices. Once, according to a letter written by a fisherman's wife to her sister in Darien, a cry carried across the reeds so sharply that she sat upright in bed and woke her husband, convinced that someone was being hurt in the marsh. He told her it was foxes. She wrote back the next morning that foxes did not sob in rhythm. For more than a year, Elias Vale came and went. Sometimes he vanished for days, sometimes for weeks. He bought salted pork, cornmeal, lamp oil, rough blankets, vinegar, and medicinal spirits in quantities too large for one household and too irregular for a legitimate boarding operation. He also purchased ledgers. That detail matters because after the great storm of January 1851, when wind and surge tore through Brackish Point with enough force to flatten docks and rip pilings from the mud, the warehouse partially collapsed. The roof went first, then part of the floor. Then the stormwater washed away the packed earth beneath the rear wall and opened the hidden level under the building like a wound. When residents returned to salvage what they could, Elias Vale was gone. But his underground chambers were not. The first deputy on site later described a ladder descending into brick compartments no normal warehouse needed. Narrow sleeping platforms, iron rings fixed at intervals into masonry, vent shafts disguised above ground by stacked crates and reed matting, a cistern for collected rainwater, a punishment room so small an adult could not stand upright in it. There were no bodies in the chambers when they were discovered, no living prisoners either. Only the architecture of confinement, the unmistakable evidence that many human beings had been held there for far too long. That was the moment the Aveline stopped looking like a maritime accident and started looking like what it almost certainly was: a theft, a conspiracy, and a privately run prison built to disappear people. From there, the case should have exploded. Instead, it slipped almost immediately into the old channels of influence and delay. Because among the wet papers recovered from the ruined quarters above the chambers were fragments from a journal. And when county clerks compared the handwriting to surviving shipping records, one name returned again and again: Nathaniel Voss, the captain of the missing Aveline. The surviving fragments are incomplete, salt damaged, copied badly, preserved unevenly in later notes, but enough remains to reconstruct the central shape of the plan. Voss had not lost the ship. He had diverted it. He had prepared a receiving site in advance, under an assumed name. He had arranged transport inland, and he intended to make money twice over, once through the insurance claim on a vanished vessel, and again through the slow private sale of the people aboard it. One entry referred to the venture as emancipation from invoices. Another, colder still, described the captives not as consigned goods, but as stock under direct management. That phrase alone strips away any illusion that this was desperation in a sudden moment. It was planning. It was paperwork. It was a business model built on the assumption that black lives could disappear if the accounting was handled carefully enough. The more investigators compared dates, the more the outline sharpened. Hollis and Pike had been under financial strain in 1849. Freight losses, credit pressure, a lawsuit over damaged cotton, rumors of insolvency. Voss, according to later testimony, had quarreled with one of the partners over compensation and family inheritance. He knew the coast, he knew the shipping routes, and he knew exactly how long a ship could go missing before rumor hardened into presumed wreck. The likely sequence, as reconstructed from fragments, was brutally efficient. The Aveline departed Savannah under lawful papers. Instead of maintaining its line toward Charleston, it slipped south at night and tucked into a narrow creek where local pilots rarely lingered after dark. Small boats met it there. The people below deck were transferred in groups under lantern cover. Then, wagons moved them inland by the marsh road to the warehouse at Brackish Point. The brig itself did not continue north. Years later, sonar would suggest it was deliberately sunk offshore, in deeper water, far from the route where anyone would think to look. The ship vanished. The paperwork looked plausible. The insurance file opened, and 173 human beings were fed, restrained, divided, and sold from underground rooms below a false commercial property. That is the broad crime. The journal fragments tell us something worse. They tell us what Voss thought he had become. In the early entries, his tone is practical. Inventory, transport, discipline, margins. But as the months continue, something uglier grows in the text. Not panic at first, not remorse, possession. He writes of testing how many could be held in each chamber before sickness spread too fast. He notes which age groups consumed the least food. He complains about noise. He records escape attempts the way another man might record cracked beams or broken tools. One fragment describes a woman who refused to let go of a child when guards tried to separate them for transport. The entry does not give her name. It gives only the delay she caused, 22 minutes. That is what slavery does to language. It takes a moment of terror and converts it into an inconvenience in a ledger. Another note mentions the rear chamber flooding ankle deep after heavy rain, and 3 children developing fever soon after. Another records that 2 men were made examples after resistance during loading. Another, in words preserved only through a court clerk's later copy, states that fear is cheaper than rope if renewed at proper intervals. There is no need to invent monsters when the archive has already done the work. Nathaniel Voss did not sound deranged in those fragments. He sounded organized. And that may be the most revolting thing in the entire record. The chambers remained active, by all indications, for roughly 13 months. Why so long? Because a single illegal sale of 173 people would have attracted attention. Gradual movement would not. Records from coastal Georgia and the Florida Panhandle later showed scattered purchases from a trader using estate papers that could not be verified. Healthy field hands, adolescent boys, household girls, a mother with an infant, small groups, never a flood, always just enough to pass as leftovers from probate, debt settlements, or dissolved plantations. Only a handful of those transactions can be tentatively linked to the Aveline with any confidence. The rest vanish into the deliberate blur of antebellum commerce, which means the central horror of this story is not just that the ship disappeared. It is that the people on it were made to disappear in a way the system itself was built to accommodate. After the chambers were found, county authorities finally moved. A warrant was drafted for Nathaniel Voss. Questions were sent toward Savannah. Agents tried to identify Elias Vale as an alias. Merchants were asked about unusual purchases. Boatmen were questioned about midnight traffic through the creeks. And almost immediately, the investigation ran into the soft wall that wealth and family connection created in the 19th century South. Hollis and Pike denied prior knowledge. They described themselves as victims of the captain's betrayal. Their attorneys argued that the disappearance of the vessel had already harmed the firm beyond measure. Insurance representatives argued the route anomalies suggested fraud. Clerks misplaced statements. Witnesses contradicted themselves. Key pages vanished. By the time prosecutors were prepared to push harder, national politics had turned feverish. Secession talk was everywhere. Courts were overloaded. Priorities shifted. The file did not close in one dramatic moment. It was smothered. Had that been the last chapter, this story would still be horrifying. But the darkness deepens because of what happened next, and because of who tried, much later, to drag the case back into daylight. In 1972, a doctoral researcher named Nora Ellison was studying disputed marine insurance cases in Savannah when she found a boxed set of copied depositions with one label that kept reappearing: Aveline. At first, she thought she had found an obscure commercial fraud. Then she found references to Brackish Point, then to concealed chambers, then to a private letter hinting that Voss had not acted alone. Ellison was not a sensationalist. People who knew her later described her as painstaking to the point of irritation. She cross-checked names, tracked land transfers, compared ink, dates, and coastal survey maps. And eventually, she located someone whose family memory had preserved what the official record tried not to say aloud. Her name was Adelaide Pike, 92 years old, living outside Macon with a daughter who thought the old stories would die if nobody asked about them. Ellison asked anyway. The interview survives only as a transcript because the original reel disappeared after Ellison's death. In that transcript, Adelaide said her grandfather had spoken of the Aveline only once, near the end of his life, when fever loosened his caution. He admitted, she said, that the company had discussed losing the ship before it ever sailed, not to kill the people aboard, not officially, never in words so naked, but to remove them from ordinary sale, collect partial insurance, and recover the greater value through private channels controlled by family and friends. Then, according to Adelaide, Nathaniel Voss cut himself loose from even that conspiracy. He kept the operation for himself. He sold where he wanted, held people longer than planned, sent less money back than promised. Obsessed with the secrecy the Marsh property gave him. Adelaide remembered her father saying that Nathaniel had always liked enclosed things, locked drawers, specimen boxes, hidden compartments and desks. A childish trait until it matured into something monstrous. That interview should have changed everything. It tied the disappearance not to one rogue captain improvising at sea, but to a deeper scheme born inside a respectable trading family. It explained why the earliest inquiries had been so strangely bloodless. It explained why insurance was discussed before rescue. It explained why so many records existed in fragments, never in full. Nora Ellison began assembling the first serious modern account of the case, and then the pattern of disappearance returned. Letters she requested from a local collection were suddenly unavailable. A clerk told her a packet had been transferred, but no office could say where. A law archive in New Orleans confirmed the existence of an insurance deposition, then reported that the relevant volume had been sent out for preservation and could not be retrieved. Ellison mentioned in a note to a colleague that a man she did not know had twice called her apartment and said nothing. 3 months later, she died of a cerebral hemorrhage at 56. That, by itself, proves nothing. But when friends entered her apartment, her notebooks were there, her draft chapters were there, her index cards were there, and the tape of Adelaide Pike's interview was gone. So was the folder that supposedly contained her full chronology of the Brackish Point property. At that point, the case had passed beyond ordinary historical frustration and entered something more corrosive. Not a grand conspiracy in the theatrical sense, something older and more common. The repeated, practical disappearance of materials that would have forced local memory to confront a profitable crime. Still, fragments kept surfacing. In 1984, a graduate student in Louisiana found part of an insurance dispute involving Hollis and Pike. Buried in the packet was testimony from a sailor named Matthew Rourke, who swore that 3 days after the Aveline left Savannah, he saw a brig matching its rig lying in a hidden inlet well south of its official course. He reported longboats moving between the vessel and shore after midnight. His statement was dismissed at the time as confusion in poor light. In 1991, a surveyor mapping erosion near the old Brackish Point Reserve noted rectangular voids beneath the ground, inconsistent with root decay or natural washout. No excavation followed. In 2006, a marine archaeology team working off the Georgia coast logged sonar on a wrecked brig in deeper water east of the historical traffic lane. The hull pattern suggested deliberate scuttling rather than storm breakup. Funding for a deeper investigation evaporated the next season. In 2014, ground-penetrating radar at the protected marshland identified chamber-like spaces roughly 15 feet below the modern surface line, right where 19th century land descriptions placed the warehouse. Officials declined invasive testing because the area was environmentally sensitive. And so the story sits in pieces. A route deviation, an alias, a marsh property, brick cells, insurance fraud, scattered sails, a wreck offshore, a researcher with missing tapes, an unmarked site where the earth still holds geometric emptiness below the roots. None of those pieces alone gives you the whole truth. Together, they give you enough to understand the shape of the crime. Nathaniel Voss almost certainly diverted the Aveline. He almost certainly brought its human cargo ashore in secret. He almost certainly used the chambers at Brackish Point as a holding facility for months while selling people through forged or manipulated papers. He almost certainly profited from both the disappearance of the ship and the disappearance of the people aboard it. What cannot be reconstructed with certainty is the part that matters most. Who were they? How many survived the chambers? How many died there? How many were marched away under false names into plantations that erased the last trace of where they had come from? History can sketch the perpetrator with disturbing detail. It cannot recover the full identities of the people he tried to turn into absence. That imbalance is its own indictment. Because slavery was not merely violence. It was administrative violence. It was the power to file one paper, destroy another, rename a person, split a family, move a body, erase a witness, and leave future generations arguing over whether enough proof remains to justify memory. The archive is not innocent in a story like this. It is one of the places where the crime kept happening. Visit the coast near the old Brackish Point site now, and you will not find a marker explaining any of this. You will find reeds, pine scrub, mud that swallows boots, wind crossing water that looks too calm to have hidden anything at all. The protected land is described in environmental language: habitat, runoff, conservation buffer. Important, all of it. Useful, all of it. But nothing on the ordinary signage tells you that below that ground, men once built chambers to store stolen black lives until the market could absorb them quietly. Nothing tells you that a ship was likely sunk on purpose, so an insurance company could argue over money, while 173 people vanished into private sale. Nothing tells you that a historian tried to restore the outline of what happened, and left behind an archive with its center removed. If there is any final twist in this story, it lies there. Not in apparitions, not in cursed waters, not in chains clinking through supernatural fog. The twist is that the landscape looks ordinary. Twist in this story, it lies there. Not in apparitions, not in cursed waters, not in chains clinking through supernatural fog. The twist is that the landscape looks ordinary. The shoreline does not announce what it knows. The marsh does not accuse. The creek does not rise up and testify. You need records for that. And records, in this case, were allowed to fail precisely where moral clarity would have cost too much. But absence speaks. A hidden warehouse built below grade by a man with no past in the settlement. Midnight wagons. Journal fragments in a captain's hand. A family interview pointing back toward premeditation. An unexplored wreck. Subsurface chambers where no natural chambers should be. A century and a half of partial recovery followed by institutional shrug. This is what buried history sounds like. Not complete silence. A pattern of broken signals. And if you listen long enough, the signals resolve into something terrible and unmistakably human. They tell you that greed alone was not enough. Greed needed logistics. Greed needed storage. Greed needed forged papers, coastal knowledge, family influence, and a legal order willing to describe kidnapped people as losses to commerce instead of lives under assault. They tell you that the people aboard the Aveline did not vanish because the sea is mysterious. They vanished because a system already existed to help powerful men convert black suffering into paperwork and then convert paperwork into forgetfulness. Maybe Nathaniel Voss died under another name. Maybe he slipped into another port and spent years pretending he had merely survived an unlucky voyage. Maybe he was recognized once, somewhere, by someone too far removed to force consequences. Maybe he drowned before the war and carried every answer with him into black water. That part, we may never know. The deeper truth is clearer than his biography. He did not need to be unique. He only needed to be ruthless, connected, and confident that the world around him valued black lives less than money. That confidence is what made the plan thinkable. Nora Ellison understood that by the end of her notes. One margin line from her surviving papers says, "When the names are taken, the crime tries to become weather." In other words, if enough time passes, if enough boxes go missing, if enough files are described as damaged, misfiled, transferred, or unavailable, then what happened to real people begins to sound like atmosphere, like tragedy without perpetrators, loss without design, history without responsibility. Ellison refused that language. So should we. The most honest ending to the Aveline story is not resolution. It is recognition. Recognition that 173 people were placed aboard a vessel under a regime that already treated them as property. Recognition that they were then almost certainly stolen again by men who wanted greater private profit. Recognition that the chambers under Brackish Point were not an aberration floating outside history, but a brutal extension of the history around them. Recognition that the records we inherit are shaped not only by what was written, but by what was intentionally kept from view. And recognition, above all, that the missing center of this story is not the captain, it is the people, the adults who understood enough to fear what was happening, the mothers trying to hold children in the dark, the children who had no framework for the terror around them, except the behavior of the adults beside them, the men who resisted and were punished for it, the sick who were logged as inconvenience, the dead whose names were not preserved because the people in power did not think their names deserved preservation. When you stand at the edge of that coast now, nothing reaches up from the reeds to prove the case to you. There is no theatrical ending, no miraculous ledger with every answer, no final confession, only the shape of what happened, and the obligation that shape creates, to say that they were here, to say that what was done to them was done by human choice, not by legend, not by curse, not by mystery alone, to say that forgetting was part of the machinery, and to say, plainly, that the people taken off the Aveline were never cargo, no matter what the manifest called them. They were people whose lives were interrupted by theft, confinement, sale, and erasure. If the marsh keeps the chambers, if the sound keeps the wreck, if the archive keeps only fragments, then memory must do the rest. Because history does not become moral simply because it is old, and the sea does not sanctify what men tried to hide beneath it. The coast is quiet now, too quiet perhaps for anyone who knows what the quiet cost. But quiet is not innocence. Quiet is what remains after testimony is scattered. Quiet is what powerful people have always hoped would follow the paper trail. Quiet is the final business partner of every buried crime. So remember the warehouse below the marsh grass. Remember the false name. Remember the hidden creek. Remember the captain who found a way to make disappearance look like weather. Remember the researcher who tried to stitch the record back together and left behind proof mostly in the shape of what others removed. And remember, above all, the 173. Not because we know enough, because we do not. Because the measure of the wrong is visible precisely in how much was taken from them, even after death, even after time, even after history claimed to have filed the matter away. The water still moves over the coast. The reeds still bend. The ground still keeps its geometry underground. Beneath all that quiet lies the oldest truth in this story. That human beings were hidden there. That other human beings profited from it. And that the work of remembrance begins wherever the official record decides it has done enough. For Brackish Point, it never did. For the people taken off the Aveline, it never will.